Okay, gents, massive game coming up in the Premier League this weekend. Newcastle United against Arsenal. The main game on Saturday. This is going to be huge in terms of the momentum for both of these teams. Nick Mendola, massive game, St James's Park. Both teams always go all out for the win in whichever game they play in. So what are you looking forward to in this one? Because on paper, this should be one of the games of the season.
Yeah, it feels very much a swing game for potentially both of these teams. Mm-hmm. And it's in a rivalry that I can tell you, someone who's watched Newcastle for a long time, there was a decade where I don't think they beat Arsenal, wherever the venue was. And it was just one of those things where there was a difference in class or reputation or whatever. This game, if it were in Arsenal, I might feel differently about it being a swing game. But St. James's Park has become what everyone has told you for a long time. Every announcer that we watched, every game for 10, 15 years would say, well, when this place is hopping, there are a few places like it. It just hasn't been hopping in some time. And it's hopping, and you can hear it. I think Andy even remarked it in our group chat within the last couple of weeks, like, wow, this building, there's a vibe around Selhurst Park I think we talk about a lot. Mm-hmm. And this is somehow like that, but more boisterous, and it's been a release. And if Newcastle can take one of the teams that have haunted it for so long, and even if it's just a good performance and a draw with the Champions League, it'll feel different. It'll feel really, really different. So I think this is bigger for Newcastle than Arsenal. And I think that makes it dangerous for Arsenal, because Arsenal's at its best when they're just going through their motions and playing their game. And I think they're going to meet a wounded team that literally wounded injury-wise. They're playing fine. That won a big game at midweek with their B team and is now saying, who's going to stop us? So I think this has all the makings of a beauty.
Yeah, no, you're right. And I mean, we look at their results at home in the Premier League, 4 wins from 5. And the only game they lost was that weird one against Liverpool where they struck a couple late on and kind of stunned them. But so that the crowd and the fact that we saw that against PSG is a huge thing for Newcastle. And you're right, though. The way players stepped up, especially Lewis Hall and Tino Livramento against Manchester United, gives Eddie Howe a bit of a headache in terms of long-term who he's picking those situations. But almost like a natural one that they've created, these young players, just the understudy roles, but are ready now to step in whenever called upon. And I think that's a great thing for Newcastle. And similar to, Arsenal, I think both teams had obviously varying degrees of success in rotating their squad players in, and we both thought the squads were stronger for Newcastle and for Arsenal heading into this season than they were last year. But Andy, that wasn't the case for Arsenal, was it? In midweek, they lost at West Ham in the League Cup. Arteta was pretty upset with the performance. I guess the question is, he's been forced into it with a few injuries to Gabriel Jesus and others, but is he rotating and experimenting a little bit too much? Because most of their success last season was built very much on a very, very settled lineup. And they had that because of no Europe, of course. But it seems to have just been a slightly different mindset this season and may have unsettled their rhythm slightly.
Yeah, we have found the new kind of annual storyline, I think. Because there are now 7 clubs, the big 7, if you will, in the Premier League. Almost every single season, at least one of them is going to miss out on qualifying, certainly for Champions League, obviously, and maybe even Europe altogether. And so the ensuing season, it was Arsenal last year, it's Spurs this year, are finding a lot of early success with not having to have, one, the deepest squad, so there's a lot less uncertainty over kind of what the pecking order is, not just for the manager, but for the players as well. And I think there's a certain comfort factor that comes with that, knowing what the expectation is going to be week to week, knowing what your schedule is going to look like, and especially having a first-time coach. Maybe that's a key component of it as well, is when you have a season outside of Europe, maybe that's when you bring in a new manager, because you have so much more time on the training field, and it's not about traveling to Europe and playing in multiple competitions. And so Arsenal certainly benefited from that last season, and that's a big factor why I thought Newcastle making the jump from not even being in European competition all the way into the Champions League was going to be a really big ask, and they've struggled a little bit in the Champions League this season, but they've pretty well held it together in the league. The only thing I will say is still looking for their first signature win in the Premier League. They've had chances against Brighton, Liverpool, and City, and they lost all 3 of those. And obviously 2 of those being away from home, and against City and Brighton are very, very difficult opponents. But this sets up perfectly for Newcastle right now, because they've got Arsenal. I don't think they've looked nearly as good as they looked last year. And obviously having the multiple competitions is factoring into that a lot. I think also part of it is we forget that progression is not linear. You don't start where you ended last season and then just continue on from there. And I think that young team is learning a little bit of that this season. And so they're not as good now as they will be at the end of the year, I don't think. And so this is a real opportunity for Newcastle to not only reestablish themselves there, within the top 4, but I think to give Arsenal a little bit of notice as well, because they've gotten away with it in a couple games recently, and they certainly didn't against West Ham. So potentially some cracks showing there.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, Nick, when we talked about it at the top in terms of both teams, this is a huge swing game. That was the term that you used in their seasons to decide how it's going to go. What is a good season for these 2 teams? Because obviously they both overachieved massively last season to finish in the top 4. But now, what is the expectation levels? Because I'm struggling to figure out a little bit for both of these teams what a good campaign will be this year.
Yeah, again, having a little bit of bias here is makes it a little tricky for me. But what I'll say is, for me, you would have to tell me how the other competitions run for Newcastle, because there's a scenario in the project where they finish 5th or 6th or 7th, but if they've won a cup, which they've been waiting for 60 years, a meaningful cup, that's everything to them. And whereas with Arsenal, I think it is, barring winning the Champions League or going deep into it, it's being in the title race the whole year. Mm. And I think what you're seeing with Arsenal that is really going to be a problem if they don't figure it out at center forward, because there's no Giroud there. There's Eddie Nketiah, who's a bit streaky, but there's no like guy who you're just going to, he's not going to score 20, but he's going to score 12. If they don't deliver, it's going to feel like the same. It shouldn't, but for their fans, it's going to start to feel like the same old Arsenal quicker than it should, because I think they feel like they shot up so quick. We're back. And teams are playing them differently. Teams are trying to take Saka out of it. Odegaard and Rice are looking for where else to go with the ball. And I don't think they're seeing outlets. And when Jesus is out, there are real questions there. And I think it is all about their attack. Arteta has shown us. Look at the Tottenham game. He had to go all out to get that draw, and he went all out. Look at the Man City game. He showed us he can play defensively to get a result too. Where is the inventiveness from his players going to come? And I think it's all on them at this point. It's on the guys on the field.
Yeah, I think good season for Arsenal is Champions League semi-finals, I'm going to say. Like, have to get there and then have to be in a title race all season. Not to win it, but just to sustain that for another year, to get as close to Man City or whoever else is up there heading into April again is good progress, I think. And then for Newcastle, top 6 again, that's great. Top 4 be a bonus. And then winning the League Cup or FA Cup, and then getting to the last 16 in the Champions League. That's a good season, I think, in my book for those 2 teams. Andy Edwards, score prediction for this one, mate.
3-2 Newcastle. Arsenal, I think, will go there and kind of look to assert themselves, and that will open the game up a little bit, maybe more than it should be or earlier than it should. And I think Newcastle will, especially if they go down a goal, which I think they could, they will be happy to play into that.
I'm going to go same scoreline, but to Arsenal. I think 3-2 to Arsenal. I see a lot of goals in this one. As I mentioned at the top, both teams don't feel like they really have that mode in them to sit back and say, we're going to approach this quite sensibly. They're much better when they're just going for it and playing at their best. So that's what I'm going for. Nick, what are we going for, mate?
Can I just choose to root for your predictions? No, I'm actually going for 1-1. Okay. I just think Newcastle is going to have to ask way too much out of Callum Wilson over the next week. And I think Arsenal has some issues there as well. And I just don't, it's going to have to be the ancillary pieces who find goals. And there are a couple good goalkeepers here there too.
True. And both these teams have Champions League games, big ones coming up around this as well. So maybe we'll see a little bit of rotation with that in mind. But it's going to be an absolute beauty of a game at St. James's Park. Newcastle against Arsenal. We'll have you covered on Pro Soccer Talk on NBCSports.com with the how to watch information, analysis, reaction, video highlights, and much more. Massive statement game for Newcastle. Can they be in the top 4 again? Maybe even the title race this season. And for Arsenal, are they legit? Can they go one step further this season and win the Premier League title? If they win at Newcastle this weekend, surely that will show that they've progressed. So Newcastle against Arsenal, it's going to be a good one.
Hi there, I'm Rebecca Lowe, studio host for NBC's coverage of the Premier League. Don't forget to hit subscribe to watch more videos all season long. And for even more Premier League content, from original series to live matches, head over to Peacock. And be sure to tune in for Premier League mornings every weekend on USA Network and on Peacock. We will see you there.